Chapter 1. A Dream of Water and Sand. A desert. Endless sand. A burning sun. For centuries, traders, merchants, and rulers had a dream, a passage through the land, a way to connect two great seas, the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, a shortcut between Europe, Africa, and Asia, a road of water. Without it, ships had to sail around Africa, a dangerous, long journey, months at sea, storms, pirates, disease, so much risk, so much time wasted. But what if there was another way? Some believed it was impossible. Others dared to try. Thousands of years ago, the ancient Egyptians had an idea. Could they dig a canal through the desert? They tried. They failed. The sands swallowed their work. Time moved on. Later, a powerful ruler, Pharaoh Necho II, tried again. He forced thousands of men to dig. They worked under the cruel sun, their hands raw, their backs aching. Many died, but the canal was not finished. Then came the Persians, then the Romans, each one looking at the land, each one trying to build. But again, failure. The desert was too strong. The dream faded. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The world changed. Ships grew bigger. Trade became more important. The need for a canal remained. But who would dare to build it? And then, in the 19th century, one man stepped forward. A Frenchman, a dreamer. A man who would not take no for an answer. His name? Ferdinand de Lesseps. He was not an engineer. He was not a king, but he had something more powerful, a vision, and the will to make it real. He had seen Egypt before. He knew its power, its beauty, and he knew its secret. A canal could be built, not by following the old ways, not by using the past, but by creating the future. The year was 1854. Egypt was under Ottoman rule, but a young leader had come to power. His name was Said Pasha. De Lesseps saw an opportunity. He spoke with passion, with confidence. He convinced Said Pasha that a canal was not just a dream. It could be real, a daring idea, a waterway through the desert. But there were problems. Many problems. First, there was the land. Sand dunes moved with the wind. The desert was alive, shifting, swallowing anything in its way. Could they control it? Then, there was water. Where would they find enough to dig? How would they stop the canal from filling with sand? And worst of all, there was power. Britain was watching. Britain, the mighty empire, ruled the seas. They loved trade. They feared losing control. If a canal was built, France and Egypt would hold the key to world trade. The British did not like this. Not at all. But de Lesseps did not stop. He gathered engineers. He found investors. He wrote plans, spoke to leaders, and traveled across Europe. He would not give up. In 1859, work finally began. A canal, straight as an arrow, cutting through the sand. The workers came, thousands, many from Egypt, many from distant lands. They dug with shovels. They carried baskets of sand. It was slow, hard, brutal work. The heat burned their skin. Disease spread. People died. And yet, the digging continued. Month after month, year after year, the canal grew. Britain tried to stop it. They doubted. They fought. They feared. But de Lesseps did not listen. One day, the canal would be finished. One day, the world would change. One day, the dream of water and sand would become real. Chapter 2. The canal rises, and so do the challenges. The sun burned hot. The desert stretched far and wide. Sand covered everything. The wind howled, carrying dust through the air. The Suez Canal was no longer just a dream. It was becoming real. But at what cost? The digging had begun. Thousands of workers arrived. Some were from Egypt. Some came from far away. They dug with shovels. They carried baskets of sand. Day after day, hour after hour. Their hands blistered. Their backs ached. Their bodies weakened. But they kept going. The canal was long, almost 200 kilometers. The work was slow. The desert fought back. The sand shifted, filling the trenches they had just dug. Water was scarce. Food was limited. The sun was cruel. And then, something worse arrived. Sickness. One by one, workers fell ill. Fever, weakness, death. The desert heat made it worse. Mosquitoes carried disease. The camps were crowded. There were no doctors, no medicine, no relief. The workers suffered. Many did not survive. Yet the canal had to be built. Ferdinand de Lesseps watched. He saw the suffering. He saw the struggle. He knew the dangers. But he could not stop now. He had promised the world a canal. He had convinced leaders. He had found investors. He had taken money from rich men in France. The world was watching. Failure was not an option. He made a decision. He brought in machines. He brought in engineers. He brought in men who knew how to fight nature. Slowly, things improved. But only a little. The workers were still exhausted. They still worked in the burning sun. And soon, a new problem appeared. Politics. The British were watching. They were nervous. A canal in Egypt? A canal controlled by France? That was dangerous. Britain ruled the seas. They controlled trade. If the canal was built, France and Egypt would have too much power. The British made their move. They sent spies. They spread rumors. They spoke to the Ottoman Empire, Egypt's rulers. "Do not trust de Lesseps," they whispered. "France wants the canal for itself." Tension rose. The Egyptian ruler, Said Pasha, was under pressure. He had trusted de Lesseps. But now he was unsure. He needed money. He needed allies. And Britain was powerful, untitled. The canal was halfway done. The workers had dug deep. The land had changed. But power? Power was still a battle. In Paris, investors grew nervous. The canal was expensive. Too expensive. Would it ever be finished? Some said yes. Some said no. They wanted results. They wanted profits. Then, a disaster. Said Pasha, the Egyptian leader, died. His nephew, Ismail Pasha, took control. And he had different ideas. He did not want the French to have too much power. He wanted the canal to belong to Egypt. De Lesseps was in trouble. He had lost his strongest ally. The British saw their chance. They whispered again. "Sell the canal," they told Ismail. "Give us control. France cannot be trusted." Ismail listened. He needed money. Egypt was in debt. The canal was costly. The British were rich. And so, a deal was made. The British bought shares. The British gained power. The canal was still unfinished. But control? It was already slipping away. De Lesseps refused to give up. He worked harder. He spoke louder. He promised success. He pushed forward. The workers continued. The sand kept shifting. The sun kept burning. And then, at last, water. For the first time, water flowed through the canal. The dream was almost real. The desert had been conquered. But one question remained. Who would own the canal when it was done? Chapter 3: A Passage to Power. The canal was complete. The desert had been conquered. The waters of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea met at last. A straight line through the sand. A passage that changed everything. November 17th, 1869. The grand opening. Flags waved, music played. Leaders from around the world arrived to witness history. A long line of ships stood ready, their captains eager. For the first time, they would sail through Egypt, not around Africa. The first ship moved forward, then the next. One by one, they passed through the canal. The journey that once took months, now took days. The world would never be the same. Ferdinand de Lesseps stood tall. He had done it. He had turned a dream into reality. He had battled the desert, the skeptics, the powerful empires that wanted him to fail. But here it was, a waterway unlike any other. The people of Egypt watched with pride. They had built this canal. They had dug with their hands under the burning sun through sickness and hardship. This was their land, their passage, their future. But was it truly theirs? Not everyone was celebrating. The British watched closely. They saw the power of the canal. They saw its value, and they saw its danger. Trade was changing. The old routes around Africa were becoming useless. The new passage was faster, cheaper, more efficient. Europe depended on it. Ships from India, from Asia, from Africa, all passed through this narrow strip of water. Control the canal, and you control world trade. Britain was not ready to let that power slip away. At first, they moved slowly. They sent merchants, investors, advisors. They placed their people in key positions. They smiled at Egypt's rulers. They offered friendship. Then they tightened their grip. The debts of Egypt grew. Ismail Pasha, the Egyptian ruler, had borrowed too much. He had spent too much. He needed money, and Britain had plenty of it. One day, a decision was made. Untitled. Ismail Pasha sold Egypt's shares of the canal. Who bought them? Britain. Overnight, Britain became the largest shareholder. De Lesseps was shocked. He had built the canal for all nations, for peace and progress. Now, one empire was taking control. But Egypt still had some power, for now. That would not last long. The people of Egypt were angry. They had worked for the canal. They had suffered for it. And now, their land, their treasure, was slipping away. Protests began. The streets filled with voices. "Egypt for Egyptians," they cried. The British did not like this. They sent more men, more ships, more soldiers. Then, in 1882, they made their move. Warships arrived in Alexandria. Cannons fired. Buildings crumbled. The city burned. Egypt fought back, but Britain was too strong. British troops marched in. They took control of the government. They took control of the land. And they took control of the canal. It was over. The British ruled Egypt. The canal, once a dream of freedom, was now a tool of empire. Ships still passed through. Trade still grew. The world still depended on the waterway. But now it belonged to Britain. The people of Egypt watched and waited. This was not the end of the story. Chapter 4: War, Money, and Betrayal. The world was changing. The 20th century had begun. Technology advanced, nations grew stronger, but so did conflicts. The Suez Canal was no longer just a waterway. It was a lifeline, a passage that carried oil, goods, soldiers, a path to power. Whoever controlled the canal controlled the world. Britain still held it. They ruled Egypt. They ruled the trade routes. But the people of Egypt were restless. They watched foreign ships pass through their land. They saw British soldiers guard the waters. This was their canal. And yet, it was not theirs at all. Then, war arrived. World War I. A war unlike any before. Europe was in flames. Millions fought. Millions died. And far away in Egypt, the canal became a target. The Ottoman Empire, once Egypt's ruler, wanted it back. Their soldiers marched through the desert. They planned to attack. But Britain was ready. The fighting began. Explosions, bullets, the heat of the desert mixed with the smoke of war. The British defended the canal with everything they had. The Ottomans tried, but they failed. The canal remained in British hands. The war ended. The world breathed. But in Egypt, nothing changed. Then, war arrived again. World War II. A war even bigger, even darker. Germany, Italy, Japan, strong, dangerous, ruthless. They wanted land. They wanted power. And the canal, it was key to victory. German forces, led by the famous General Rommel, moved across North Africa. Fast, deadly. They pushed towards Egypt, towards the canal. The British were afraid. If they lost the canal, they would lose the war. The desert became a battlefield once more. Tanks rolled over the sand. Soldiers fought under the burning sun. The world held its breath. Would the canal fall? Untitled. Then, a turning point. 1942. The Battle of El Alamein. The British fought back, hard. A final push, a final chance. The battle was brutal. Explosions shook the ground. Smoke filled the sky. Men fell. And then, silence. Germany was defeated. Rommel retreated. The canal was safe. Again. But Egypt had seen enough. Years of war, years of occupation, years of watching others decide their fate. The people had waited for a leader, someone who would take back what was theirs. That leader was coming. In the streets of Cairo, whispers grew louder. In coffee houses, in markets, in homes, people spoke of change. A young officer listened. He watched. He planned. His name was Gamal Abdel Nasser. The war ended. The world moved on. But Egypt would not forget. Britain still controlled the canal. The world still used its waters. But the people of Egypt had made a decision. This canal would be theirs again. Chapter 5. The Suez Crisis, a battle for control. A single voice echoed across Egypt, strong, defiant, proud. We shall fight for our rights. It was July 26, 1956. The world listened. The man speaking was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, and his message was clear. The Suez Canal, the lifeline of trade, the jewel of empires, was no longer under foreign control. It belonged to Egypt. The crowd erupted. Cheers, shouts, fists in the air. The people had waited for this moment. Their leader had done what no one before him had dared. He had taken back their canal. But far away, in London, in Paris, and in Tel Aviv, there was anger. Britain, France, Israel, 3 powerful nations, 3 governments that had just lost something precious. The British had ruled the canal for decades. They saw it as theirs. The French had helped build it. They felt betrayed. And Israel? Israel feared its enemies. The canal was a road for weapons, for war, for danger. Nasser had made his move. Now they would make theirs. In secret, the 3 nations met. They spoke in whispers. They planned in shadows. A war was coming. Untitled. It began on October 29th, 1956. Israeli tanks rolled into Sinai, the desert between Egypt and Israel. Their planes roared overhead. Their soldiers moved fast. Egypt fought back, but the attack was swift, powerful. 2 days later, Britain and France made their move. Under the excuse of protecting the canal, they sent an ultimatum. Egypt must stop fighting. Nasser refused. He would not back down. And so, the bombs fell. British and French warplanes attacked Egyptian cities, Alexandria, Cairo, Port Said. Explosions filled the night. Buildings crumbled. Fire lit the sky. The canal, the great waterway, was now a battlefield. The world watched in shock. This was not just a war over land. It was a war over power. And two giants were watching. The United States and the Soviet Union, rivals in the Cold War. Each had their own plans. Each had their own fears. And neither wanted Britain and France to control the canal again. Then, a warning. A voice from Moscow. If you do not stop, we will act. A threat. A dangerous one. The Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, hinted at war, even nuclear war. The world held its breath. Then, another voice. This time, from Washington. Enough. The United States had spoken. President Eisenhower was furious. He saw the truth. This was not about peace. This was about empire. He demanded the attacks stop. He threatened economic punishment. He put pressure on Britain, on France, on Israel. And it worked. On November 6th, 1956, the fighting stopped. The British and French pulled back. The Israelis withdrew. The invasion had failed. Nasser had won. Egyptian soldiers stood by the canal. The people cheered once more. The canal was not just water. It was independence. It was freedom. It was theirs. The Suez Crisis had ended, but the world had changed. Britain and France weakened. Their age of empire was fading. The United States and the Soviet Union, stronger. Their Cold War now shaped the world. And Egypt? Egypt had risen. Chapter 6. A lifeline for the world. The canal was Egypt's once again. The people had fought. They had won. No more foreign control. No more British soldiers standing guard. No more whispers of empire. The Suez Canal belonged to Egypt, but victory came with a cost. The world needed the canal. Every day ships carried oil, goods, wealth through its waters. It was a path between nations, between continents, between power and survival. Without it, the world would slow down. Economies would suffer. Nations would panic. Egypt held the key. Yet peace did not last long. A new enemy was rising. Untitled. War. The 6-day war between Israel and its neighbors. Bombs, tanks, soldiers, the Middle East in flames. The canal became a front line. Egypt fought to keep control. But Israel's forces were strong. They pushed forward, taking the Sinai Peninsula. The canal was now a border between enemies. Egypt had no choice. President Nasser gave the order. Block the canal. Ships were trapped inside. Stuck. Waiting. Unable to move. For 8 years, the canal remained closed. Trade stopped. Goods could not pass. The world searched for other routes, but nothing compared to Suez. Egypt suffered. The economy struggled. Cities by the canal fell silent. The waterway, once filled with life, was now a battlefield of the past. Then, in 1973, war again. The Yom Kippur War. Egypt attacked, crossing the canal. It was a fight to take back Sinai, a fight for honor, for pride, for land. The war ended, but something had changed. Peace talks began. Egypt and Israel spoke, not as enemies, but as nations searching for a solution. A historic agreement. The Camp David Accords. For the first time, Egypt and Israel made peace. Israel left the Sinai. And the canal, it was reopened. The ships returned. The trade returned. The world breathed again. But danger never disappeared. The 1980s, the 1990s, terrorist attacks, political instability. Every threat to Egypt was a threat to the canal. The world watched. The world depended on Suez. Then, a new century. Global trade exploded. China, India, the Gulf. The canal was busier than ever. Bigger ships, more goods, more oil. The world's economy flowed through this narrow passage. But what happens when the passage is blocked? March 2021. A single ship. The Ever Given. A mistake. A miscalculation. A strong wind. And suddenly, the world stopped. A massive ship stuck in the canal. Sideways. Unmoving. Every minute, millions of dollars lost. Every hour, ships lined up, waiting. Every day, world leaders panicked. Egypt rushed to fix it. Machines, engineers, diggers. The whole world watched. Then, after 6 days, movement. The Ever Given was freed. Trade continued. The crisis was over, but it was a warning. The Suez Canal is not just water. It is power. It is control. Egypt holds it. The world needs it. And in a world full of change, one thing remains true. Whoever controls the Suez Canal controls the future. Chapter 7. Blockades, attacks, and the canal's darkest days. The ships stopped. The waterway went silent. The Suez Canal, once alive with movement, was now a graveyard. Empty. Blocked. Forgotten. The year was 1967. War had come again. The 6-Day War. Egypt and Israel. 2 nations, 1 conflict. The battles raged across the desert, across the skies, across the sea. And then, the canal became a border. A line between enemies. No ship could pass. Egypt made a decision. Seal it. Block it. Defend it. Inside the canal, 14 ships were trapped, their engines off, their crews stranded. They called it the Yellow Fleet, named after the desert dust that covered them. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The war ended, but the canal did not reopen. It was too dangerous. The waters were filled with mines hidden beneath the surface. Along the banks, soldiers watched, ready, waiting. The world felt the loss. Without the canal, ships had to travel around Africa. Thousands of kilometers extra. More time, more fuel, more cost. Trade slowed. Businesses suffered. Economies weakened. And Egypt? Egypt was trapped. The canal was a lifeline, bringing money, power, and influence. But now it brought nothing. Untitled. Years passed. 1968, 1969, 1970. The canal remained closed. Egypt struggled. The people waited. They had fought for their land, but now their prize was useless. Then, in 1973, war came again. The Yom Kippur War. Egypt attacked. A surprise assault. Across the canal, soldiers stormed Israeli defenses. A bold move. A desperate fight. For a moment, it seemed Egypt would win. But the war was brutal. The losses were heavy. The fighting ended in a stalemate. The war had changed everything. The world intervened. Peace talks began. The enemies sat at the table, not with weapons, but with words. Years of negotiation followed. Promises, threats, agreements. Then, in 1975, a breakthrough. An agreement was signed. Israel withdrew from Sinai. And the canal? It reopened. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat stood by the water. His people gathered. The world watched. He gave the order. And after 8 long years, the first ship sailed through. The silence was broken. The canal was alive again. But something had changed. The world had seen the power of the canal. It could connect the world. It could divide the world. It could stop the world. And if it ever closed again, the world would feel it. Chapter 8. The Ever Given. When the world stopped. A single ship, a narrow canal, and then nothing moved. The date was March 23, 2021. The world was busy. Ships sailed across oceans, carrying goods, oil, food, and medicine. The Suez Canal, as always, was the shortcut, linking east and west, connecting nations, making trade faster, cheaper, easier. But that morning, something went wrong. The Ever Given, one of the largest container ships in the world, entered the canal, 400 meters long, 220,000 tons. A floating giant. It carried thousands of shipping containers. It was heading north. The weather was bad. The winds were strong. The ship moved forward, but something was off. It struggled to stay straight. The canal was narrow, too narrow. Then, disaster. The Ever Given turned sideways. Its bow hit one bank. Its stern hit the other. A ship, bigger than the Eiffel Tower, was now stuck between two walls of sand. And just like that, the canal was blocked, untitled. At first, no one believed it. A ship stuck? It would be fixed in hours, right? But as the hours passed, reality set in. Ships lined up, waiting, hundreds of them. They carried oil, cars, electronics, food, animals, billions of dollars in goods. Every hour, $400 million was lost. Every day, $9 billion vanished. Factories had no materials. Stores had no products. The world depended on the canal, and now it was frozen in time. Egyptian engineers rushed to help. Tugboats pulled, diggers worked, machines roared, nothing moved. The internet exploded. Memes, jokes. But beneath the laughter, fear. What if they couldn't move it? What if the canal stayed closed for weeks? What if global trade collapsed? 6 days passed. Then, hope. High tide arrived. The water rose. The tugboats pulled harder. The diggers dug deeper. And finally, the Ever Given moved. A cheer went up. The canal was free. Ships sailed again. Trade resumed. The crisis was over. But the world had learned a lesson. The Suez Canal, so small on a map, held immense power. One accident, one mistake, and the whole world felt it. What does the future hold? Larger ships? Better technology? More control? One thing is certain. The Suez Canal is not just water. It is history, economy, power, and risk. And as long as the world depends on it, the world will watch it closely.